Imagine a cold, dimly lit basement in a quiet Czech town, where the air smells of decay and the walls seem to press in with a weight that feels almost alive. In the flickering shadows, two small figures crouch inside crude cages. Children, though their thin, battered bodies make them barely recognizable. They are covered in bruises and wounds, evidence of months of unimaginable suffering. This was not a scene from a horror film. It was a cruel reality that police uncovered in 2007, one of the most horrifying cases of child abuse in recent history. At the center of it were two sisters, Klára and Katerina Mauerová, whose lives would take a dark and tragic turn no one could have foreseen. Klára was the eldest daughter in a seemingly normal family. Born in 1975, she grew up with her sister in Cannibal, a small, peaceful village about 120 miles from Prague. It was a quiet, picturesque place where life moved at an easy pace with good schools and a strong sense of community. The kind of town where things like this shouldn't happen. Little is known about the Mauerova sisters' early years, but one thing was clear. Something wasn't right with Klára from a young age. She was a pretty child, with blonde hair and bright blue eyes, but beneath her innocent appearance, her mind was beginning to unravel. Early signs of schizophrenia started to surface. Schizophrenia is a brutal disorder, twisting a person's perception of reality, causing them to see and believe things that aren't there. For Klára, these delusions took on a religious form, filling her head with strange fantasies of divine purpose. No official diagnosis was ever made, but those around Klára noticed the change. Over time, her younger sister Katerina, like many siblings, began to mimic her. Unfortunately, what she copied was not just her sister's behavior, but her increasingly unstable mental state. Together, they fell deeper into their shared world of religious delusions. They convinced themselves that they were chosen for some higher purpose, feeding off each other's fantasies until their grip on reality was barely there. Despite their growing madness, Klára managed to live a seemingly ordinary life. She finished school, went to university to study pedagogy, and even found love with a man who accepted her, flaws and all. They married, and for a brief time, it seemed like things were looking up. When their first child, Jakub, was born, it was a moment of hope, a sign that Klára might escape the darkness in her mind and build a life full of love and normalcy. But the darkness was never far behind. And soon, it would consume everything. Nearly 2 years after the birth of her first child, Klára was pregnant again, and soon welcomed her second son, Andrei. But while the family grew, so did the cracks in her relationship with her husband. As time passed, Klára's erratic behavior, her mood swings and even bouts of aggression, became too much for her husband to handle. Eventually, it all reached a breaking point, and he left, abandoning Klára with their 2 young boys. Despite the heartbreak, Klára did her best to keep life moving forward for her children. She was dedicated to their studies, encouraging their involvement in activities like summer camps, school events, and family vacations. Outwardly, she was still fulfilling her role as a mother, but inside, the loneliness and resentment weighed heavily on her, dragging her deeper into depression. In her isolation, Klára turned to the one person she trusted, her younger sister, Katerina. Hoping that her sister's presence might ease her emotional burden, Klára invited Katerina to move in with her and the boys. It was during this time that a new figure entered their lives. A girl named Anička, who claimed to be just 12 years old. Some reports say Klára met Anička at university, where the girl told her she had run away from a youth care center after suffering mistreatment. Others suggest that Katerina, who worked at a local youth institution, encountered Anička, who said she had escaped from a human trafficking ring. There were many stories about how Anička came into their lives, but all led to the same unsettling truth. This child was no ordinary girl. The Mauerova sisters, driven by their own delusions and religious fervor, welcomed Anička into their home with open arms. To them, she seemed like a gift, an innocent, vulnerable girl who needed protection. But Anička was hiding an extraordinary secret. She wasn't a helpless child at all. In reality, she was a 32-year-old woman named Barbara Shkrlova. Barbara suffered from a condition that made her appear much younger than she was. With her childlike face and small stature, she had perfected the art of deception, manipulating those around her into believing she was a vulnerable young girl. She exploited this to gain sympathy and secure a place in the homes of people who were moved by her tragic backstory. There are reports of one family who took her in, convinced they were adopting a young girl in need. However, Barbara's violent and unpredictable behavior soon surfaced, and the family discovered the shocking truth about her real age, leading to her return to the state's child welfare system. Barbara's history was filled with stints in psychiatric institutions from which she often managed to escape. But none of this was known to Klára and Katerina. To them, Anička was a helpless child in need of love and care. They quickly grew attached to her, and before long, they made the fateful decision to adopt her. A decision that would lead directly to disaster. At first, everything seemed to go smoothly with the addition of the so-called child to the family. But it wasn't long before Barbara began to feel envious of the loving attention Klára's biological children received. She started causing trouble, engaging in mischievous behavior, and creating disruptions, for which she then blamed the two young boys, ages 10 and 8. The boys, in turn, were unfairly reprimanded, often without reason. These increasingly tense situations undoubtedly worsened the fragile mental state of the Mauerova sisters. It appears that Barbara's skillful manipulation gave her control over the sisters, allowing her to slowly influence their decisions. Around this time, Barbara began discussing the religion she followed, called the Grail movement. Research into this group shows it to be an apocalyptic religious organization that believes in a coming transformation of society. Followers, organized into small groups known as circles, interpret the teachings in their own way, guided by the idea that good deeds on earth will ensure a place in heaven. However, it seems that within some circles, these good deeds were believed to absolve members of any wrongs they may have committed. Barbara belonged to one of these circles and soon convinced Klára and Katerina to join her. According to various accounts, this particular group was involved in troubling practices, including violence, exploitation, and other morally questionable acts. At the center of this group was a mysterious figure known as the Doctor, who communicated with his followers through text messages, issuing instructions that were often beyond comprehension. One of the first deeply concerning actions, which went largely unnoticed, was when Klára withdrew her son Andrei from school, claiming he had become deaf and mute and that she would be homeschooling him. This marked the beginning of a descent into something far darker for the family. From that moment on, any wrongdoings, whether genuine or made up by Barbara, led to Jacob and Andrei experiencing severe punishments. They were hit with disproportionate force for their transgressions, whether real or imagined, using objects as hard as spoons or belts, and even worse, being locked in small, dark rooms at night, exploiting Barbara's control over the siblings. In a more extreme approach, Barbara suggested locking the disobedient children permanently to a local blacksmith to set an example and curb their continued misconduct. The blacksmith was tasked with constructing a cage, unaware of what its purpose would be once completed. This iron cage was then installed in the house's basement, where the children were confined over several months. Klára's sons endured a nightmare filled with cruelty, following the physician's orders received via text messages. They faced torture, including being pinched repeatedly, tied up, whipped, and deprived of food for days. Being trapped in the cage, they were unable to escape, forcing them to use makeshift toilets and sleep on the dirty ground. Every week, pretending to clean up the odor, the women would drench the children and the basement with cold water. However, their suffering did not end there. At one point, the boys were taken to cabins hidden deep in the forest and locked in smaller cages. During this period, more members of the Grail movement assembled and subjected the boys to a week of brutal abuse. They were submerged in buckets of water, suffocated with plastic bags until nearly unconscious, beaten, forced into battles with each other, and made to dig what they believed were graves. Cigarettes were burned into their flesh. They were often bound by their hands and feet, their mouths sealed with tape, and subjected to sexual abuse. Upon their return to their prison, located in the basement of their family residence, the circumstances took a turn for the worse. Barbara came up with a strategy to overfeed the boys while they were confined, aiming to make them gain weight. One day, the three women went down to the basement, and Klára asked her younger son to stretch his leg through the bars of the cage. The frightened child complied, and as soon as his leg was within reach, Katerina and Barbara seized it, while Klára swiftly made a cut, dividing the flesh among them, which led to hysterical laughter. This nightmare-worthy scenario persisted for roughly 6 months, from December 2006 to June 2007. During this time, Barbara came up with another ingenious plan to monitor the children. They bought baby monitoring cameras and installed one in the basement, allowing them to not only oversee the children's every move but also witness their suffering whenever one of the women would go down to torment them while the others were busy with household tasks. Little did they know, this clever plan would ultimately lead to their downfall, in a way that seemed almost miraculous. On May 10, 2007, a neighbor of the Mauerova Sisters was installing a baby monitor in his house to keep an eye on his newborn while he slept. After setting up the camera, he turned it on to ensure everything was functioning properly. To his shock, instead of seeing his baby's crib, the screen displayed a dark area where a small child, with his arms tied behind him, was struggling to eat food from the floor with his mouth. At another moment, the screen showed an adult woman's hand holding something, while the child desperately tried to consume it. The image was so disturbing that the neighbor was horrified and immediately called the police to report the appalling scene. Moments later, officers arrived at his home and were met with the horrifying images. The advanced range of their equipment made it clear that the source of this terror was very close. Determined to put an end to the nightmare as swiftly as possible, the officers began to knock on the doors of nearby homes. The initial few residents had no issue allowing the police access to every room until they reached the house where the Mauerova sisters lived. Initially, the sisters were hesitant to let the police in, but eventually relented. During the inspection, the police discovered a small door hidden under the staircase. To their shock, what they found was beyond what anyone could imagine. Stepping inside, they were overwhelmed by a terrible stench that filled the entire space. The first sight was of a terrified girl clutching a teddy bear, running directly towards the officers, screaming in fear that she and her brothers had been abused by their adoptive mother and aunt. One officer took the girl outside, while the others were left in disbelief at the sight of two nearly naked boys, their bodies covered in wounds, locked inside cages as if they were animals. One of the boys appeared unconscious. Without hesitation, the boys were immediately freed and attended to by emergency services. They quickly provided first aid and rushed them to the hospital for further treatment. The girl, who didn't seem to have any physical injuries, was taken into custody by the authorities. Klára and Katerina were arrested. Jacob had some wounds that were treated but did not require hospitalization, so both children were sent to a child protection center. However, Andrei, the younger boy, was in critical condition when he arrived at the hospital. Upon realizing he had not been returned to the basement, he experienced a panic attack, began to scream that he was seeing ghosts, and begged the doctors to end his suffering. The situation could not have been more tragic. When he calmed down, the doctors could not believe what they saw in the boy. He was covered in scars, bruises, and open wounds, one of which was particularly large on one of his buttocks. He had to remain hospitalized for proper treatment. While healing physical wounds on their body, injury was caused by months of terrible violence with their mother, aunt, and others, so much harder to overcome in the meantime that research began to reveal the truth about what happened behind closed doors in this house, and at the same time in the lives of the population were placed in the care center, believed that the young girl refused to work with advisors and professionals who showed aggression and sadness, but she also began to make mistakes that pointed out the truth during the initial assessment of her mental condition. She got paper and crayon to draw what, instead, she wanted a children's drawing. She produced complex geometric shapes and improved mathematical calculations that go beyond what could be expected from 13 years old. Unfortunately, Annika's studies were never completed. A few days after being placed in the center, she escaped through the window without leaving a trace. Security forces immediately began searching for the girl and distributed leaflets with her photograph and information. To surprise, they soon received tips from various sources who claimed that she was recognized in the picture and claimed that she was a 33-year-old woman named Barbara, seemed to receive help from a known couple who provided her son's documents. In order to leave the country, she initially went to Denmark, and from there to Oslo. In Norway, Barbara again changed her appearance and shaved her head and posed like a 13-year-old boy named Adam, She turned to the authorities and claimed she was on a ran from a malicious father. Several sources say that Adam was occupied by the family and entered a school where he was soon considered a gifted student. This charade continued for several months, but the Czech authorities did not give up, and, in cooperation with international colleagues, the pieces of the puzzle were managed together. DNA analysis eventually confirmed the true identity of Barbara, which led to her arrest. After that, she was extradited back to the Czech Republic to face legal proceedings. After her return, Barbara was assessed psychologically in a number of ways. At least one expert who dealt with her reportedly noticed indications of psychotic tendencies. Among the most startling revelations was the rumored fact that a worried instructor was the reason behind Barbara's imprisonment in Norway. Barbara had drawn a picture of 7 bruised and bleeding children, each with a number, and identified herself as the 7th, which had worried the teacher when she was posing as Adam. Hundreds of reporters and television teams crowded the municipal court in the Czech city of Brno on Friday, May 9, 2008, taking pictures of Katerina and Barbara being led inside. The two ladies were accused of tricking the personnel of a daycare center by pretending that Barbara was Annika, a 13-year-old adopted girl. They were not released even though the court apparently dismissed part of the charges. They were taken into custody right away and accused of major crimes including child abuse. 4 other members of the group they belonged to were also included in the charges. Visibly distraught and shrunken, Klára was spotted approaching the courtroom with her sister as the trial got underway. Along with 3 other people, Barbara also made her way into the courtroom. When Klára's turn came to testify, she confessed to abusing her kids over a period of several months. She asserted, nonetheless, that Barbara and her sister Katerina had tricked her. Klára claimed they had put her into a delusional condition, engulfing her in the Grail movement to the extent she was unable to recognize the seriousness of what she was doing. Additionally, Barbara reportedly stated that she had suffered abuse at the hands of the Mauerova Sisters. But the court mostly disregarded her assertions, and few people found her credible. Jacob and Andre had the chance to speak with the judge directly, who described the horrifying experiences they went through. They told how the accused violated their privacy, forced them to live in near starvation for months in inhumane conditions, and even cannibalized parts of their bodies. During the hearings, the officers who had entered the House of Horrors also testified. One of the officers described how they saw a youngster lying on the floor, naked, as soon as they entered the basement. He pointed out that the Mauerova sisters showed no concern for the child's welfare, and the girl identified as Annika even tried to block the officers by clinging to their legs. At the end of the hearings, the prosecutor stated that the motive behind these horrific acts was to force the children into complete submission to the group's religious goals. When sentencing, the judge explained that the ultimate aim of these atrocities was to utterly break the will of the children. He also noted that, although there were signs of cult involvement, there wasn't enough evidence to prove it. In the end, the judge found all 6 accused guilty and handed down their sentences. Klára Mauerová, the boy's mother, was sentenced to 9 years in a maximum security prison, while her sister Katerina received a 10-year sentence. The other 3 individuals were convicted of abuse and given 7 years. Barbara, then 34, was found guilty of repeated abuse and cruelty, but received a lighter sentence of only 5 years in prison. The identity of the so-called doctor, believed to be behind the group's actions, was never confirmed. Many were shocked by what seemed like surprisingly light sentences, considering the brutal violence inflicted on 2 innocent children. Moreover, reports revealed that Barbara was released on parole after serving just half of her sentence, meaning she was out after only 2.5 years. Her lawyer argued that her deteriorating mental health played a role in her early release. Meanwhile, Jacob and Andre, with the help of specialists, have managed to overcome much of the trauma, though those events will undoubtedly stay with them forever. Thanks for tuning in to Mysterious Oracle. If you're fascinated by mysteries from around the world, be sure to subscribe for more thrilling investigations and captivating stories.